Yeah, you know, one of the things. That's a fact. One of the things that we were throwing out around here was the same thing that you just mentioned, how the continuity of government plan was in place, and I'm sure the FEMA actually had their plans. So the question that I wanted to ask you, and maybe you can answer after the break. We're approaching a break here, but is if the continuity of government plans were already in place, did they take over the media? Because we know the executive orders up in the 10,000s say that they can take over all modes of transportation, media, and basically do whatever they want. Was the media taken over on 9/11? Were they reading off a government script?
Well, I would suspect absolutely. I think right after that first attack, the media was absolutely vetted in what they were allowed to do. There's only so much you can do with the live feeds. But as to what they were to be told and what to put out, I mean, there was one suspect that day, and his name is Osama bin Laden. There was nobody else.
Yeah, and then in addition to that, Jason, I have some clips that I got off of YouTube of the media and how they were already talking about the collapse from the plane fires thing. So when we get back, folks, more Jason Bermas and your call. Stay tuned, folks. AnimalFarmShow.com.
Go to the internet and watch Loose Change.
AnimalFarmShow.com. Thank you for joining us. We're talking to Jason Bermas, of course, very, very popular in the community. And I know with this whole new NIST report, we left off talking about the possible shadow government, specifically talking about the FEMA Executive Order 10995. And
yes, so that just to state that allows the government to seize and control the communication media. It's a very broad executive order, but that's what it means.
Yeah, and this is very interesting because this opens up all kinds of possibilities about so many attacks on this country and when have they taken over the media? Was it on 9/11? And of course, Jason, you're still with us, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah, and there were so many examples of how, when you look back, after knowing what we know now, years later after all the research, you look back at some of the very early media reports and some of the early just media conversations, interviews, and some of them are just so strange that it's almost impossible that they could have been natural. And I want to play one or actually there's three of them, and listen close to them. We'll have Jason comment on them.
And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
Wow. Now, this is on YouTube, folks.
It's Harley Man. I know exactly what clip that is.
Obviously, Jason. I mean, obviously, you're like a textbook, like a dictionary on the topic. But this guy, he's wearing like a Harley Davidson shirt, and he's being interviewed. I think this is right after the second plane.
Obviously, because of the structural integrity.
This is right after the building's collapse, and this guy is like, he doesn't seem like he's even phased at all that these two men.
And not only that, but check out, he has a press pass or some kind of a pass that gets him around his neck. And number two, he talks about how he was on the scene of the towers collapsing. There's not an ounce of dust on the guy.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. And then, we're talking about the biggest attack in American history on our soil. This guy's coming off like the friggin' mayor.
Witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, listen, scientists couldn't conclude that at that point because it just happened. But this guy obviously is so smart. So that's the first example of, wow, this is strange that this is all of a sudden there's the official story and this just happened. So that's example one.
That just the velocity of the plane and the fact that you have a plane filled with fuel hitting that building that burned, and you had that intense heat, probably weakened the structure as well.
Yeah, and again, this is another story. I think this was CBS. Right after the buildings collapsed, they get these experts on it. Oh, of course it must. Now, again, this is a pretty trivial thing. Even to this day, we cannot necessarily conclude, or at least all agree, and probably never will be, over what the cause of the Twin Towers falling are. And now, and then that's example number two. And example number three is, I think, even worse.
And I think it was simply the planes hitting the buildings.
Yeah. He's poised to strike again. Immensely wealthy man. And a very private man. He has been granted a safe haven by Afghanistan's ruling Taliban movement. And during his time in hiding, he has called for a holy war against the United States and specifically for the killing of Americans and Jews.
Yeah, so, I mean, and I was talking about, of course, Osama bin Laden. I mean, and I remember watching it in my dorm room, and I'm sitting there, and of course I was shocked because I was miles away from it. But yeah, right off the bat, here's who did it, here are their names, look at their pictures. And, at first I didn't think twice about it, but now you look back and you say, oh my God, they had this plan in the works right off the bat. And then that's why we talk about the order here, 10995, the executive order, where they could just get the ability to take over the media. So,
oh my God.
Jason, any other examples that we're missing? I'm sure there are many.
Well, I mean, the intro of my film is 9/11. It's only about a 2.5-3 minute intro, but in that intro, about 30 seconds, is just dedicated to everybody blaming bin Laden. They said things like they were 90% certain that day that he deployed 50 terrorists. And these are all talking heads like Tim Russert, Oliver North, the people you still see on television today, Tom Brokaw. And just to kind of slide back to COG, another thing I put in this movie that a lot of people aren't aware of is that this was all in place back in the 40s and 50s, but it was revamped in the 80s when Reagan was president. And the person that headed that revamping of the department through the National Programs Office
George Bush Sr.
was George Bush Sr. He headed the program.
Ding, 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 ding.
Exactly. And what's crazy about that is that Cheney's been in the line of succession since its inception. Okay? He was obviously put in charge, at least publicly, through COG on that day. And we have all sorts of evidence to back that up. He was in the bunker prior to the Pentagon strike. It was joked about at a prime rib dinner. George Bush actually joked about it. That's in the film, how Dick Cheney had been running the country, and when he wasn't running the country out of a bunker, he was running it out of his suitcase. So I think people should keep that in mind when you realize what the shadow government is. I mean, it's really upper echelon of the Bush administration that gives no care for the Constitution whatsoever.
Yeah, but Jason, unfortunately, we have a long road to travel, my good friend, because people still think George Bush has been running this country for the last seven and a half years. People still have a long way to go before they can even try to understand who's really behind the government and their actions. But you have a question there, Ben?
I do. Yeah. One of the things I wanted to ask you, and we learned this through Michael Rupert's research, where Major Don Arias was the NORAD spokesperson. He talked to him about the military exercises that were happening that day, the multiple military exercises, and how the possibility of them all being interconnected and linked and run by a quote-unquote maestro. Can you comment on that?
He says that it's Cheney. If I had found any real hard evidence of that, I mean, I'm not discrediting him, but Rupert's attacked me as CIA disinfo before. I think he is, yeah, exactly. And he's a big peak oiler, so, I mean, I take everything with a grain of salt. If I could have found anything that said to me, Dick Cheney was in charge of the whole thing, I obviously would have presented it. Instead, I present things like, well, there were more targets that morning, okay? There was a list that circulated before the attacks that Dave Mitchell, the Maryland police chief, got and contacted Paris Glendening, the governor of Maryland at the time, where there were 11 targets. And by the time he had been contacted, the Pentagon and World Trade Center had already been hit, and those were, of course, on the list. So was the World Trade Center in Baltimore. So was the Sears Tower. So it seems like there was definitely more going on. I mean, I think that's why they had all these false blips in the air. They had all these other planes that they thought were hijacked, such as Delta 1989 supposedly had a bomb on board. They followed another hijacking out of Alaskan airspace, which came through Canada. But the really funny thing is they're following all these planes that actually have the hijack codes put in. Well, we know that the 4 planes that supposedly were used in the attacks never put those hijack codes in. So, in this film, we're taking a look at a lot of things that have kind of flown under the radar in, I guess, the main line of the 9/11 Truth Movement. And I want to let everybody know that it's going to launch a little bit early over at PrisonPlanet.tv, and the encodes look great. Like, ever since I've gotten down here, one of my big things is ripping stuff for the web. And, these are DVD quality. DivX is like my best friend. And I can't wait for it to drop, man. I'm very excited to see what people have to say about it. I just gave a pre-copy to Dylan and Corey, and Dylan enjoyed it. He was kind of surprised, taken aback by some of the information he didn't even know. So I think it's going to be, a great add-on for the Truth Movement, and maybe be able to bring in some more new people the way Loose Change brought new people in.
Sure, yeah, Jason, well, listen, I feel the joy, too. I mean, the video codecs that are coming out today and the technology, how fast it's growing between DivX and the QuickTime and H.264, it's great. And it really,
it's magical.
It really does. It just enables us, and just anybody for that matter, to use the Internet that much more effectively, because now video is getting so much better in quality. Before you know it, it's all going to be huge HD. So, I'm so excited. Yeah, I'm excited, too. And we're all, listen, Jason, we're all anticipating it, and for all, by all means, we'll definitely promote it on the show. But I did want to, before this break, we only got about a minute and 15 seconds, but I wanted to ask you just quickly about the BBC reporting that Building 7, the Salomon Brothers building, had fallen before it actually fell, and we saw the live feed. What are your thoughts on that in less than 50 seconds?
Sure. I called it from the very beginning. I didn't think the BBC was in on some conspiracy. I said, hey, someone put this out over an AP wire too early. They picked it up along with, CNN, and then they broadcast it as fact. I think the real damning thing is that they gave the official version 30 minutes before the building fell. They said due to structural damage and fire, this building came down, and that was towing the line for the last 7 years until today.
Yeah, and this is another reason why, Jason, it's another reason why this new NIST report just gets me that much more heated, because they're talking about the scientific evidence, which, of course, is part of the problem and a very big part, but we have to start talking about the media, about Silverstein, about all of the other things, about the countdown, about all the other things that really need an answer. So, folks, we'll get your phone calls, 512-646-1984. When we return with Jason Bermas, much more on the farm. Stay tuned, folks. We shall return.
Now, throw the switch and let us begin the battle for the planet.